Let's listen to 3 disturbing stories from people who were alone in their homes. I doubt you'll be able to sleep tonight after hearing them. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It was an old house, full of dark corners and secrets kept for decades. In the dusty attic where light barely managed to seep in, a man rummaged through boxes forgotten by time. He was tall, thin, with deep, dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. His fingers trembled as they touched the dust-covered objects, as if each one carried a weight he didn't want to remember. Then he found the mirror. Large, with an ornate and worn frame, it seemed out of place among the old furniture and dented boxes. The man wiped the dusty surface with his shirt sleeve, revealing a dark, slightly foggy glass. And it was there, in that moment, that he realized something was wrong. His reflection didn't mimic him. While he frowned, confused, the reflection smiled. A wide, almost cruel smile that didn't match the man's serious expression. He stepped back, feeling a chill down his spine, but the reflection remained there, smiling, as if it knew something he didn't. And in that instant, the man realized that this wasn't just an old house. It was a place where the past and the present intertwined in ways he could never understand. The man in that old house had a name, Daniel, a writer who, in happier times, filled pages with stories that touched the hearts of thousands. But those times were long gone. 2 years ago, a car accident took away everything he loved most: his wife, Anna, and his daughter, Sophia. Since then, Daniel had lived like a ghost, trapped in a house that was more a museum of painful memories than a home. The house was too big for one man. Empty hallways echoed his footsteps, and the rooms seemed to hold the sadness of those who once inhabited them. Daniel avoided Sophia's room, where stuffed animals still waited for a child who would never return. He also avoided looking at the photos on the living room wall, where smiles frozen in time reminded him of everything he had lost. The mirror, however, seemed to have found a place in the study, a room Daniel still tried to call his own. It was there that he spent hours sitting at his desk, staring at a blank screen. The words no longer came. His creativity had dried up, leaving only a void that echoed the silence of the house. But the mirror was there, in the background, reflecting not only Daniel, but also a subtly distorted version of reality. Sometimes he noticed movements in the reflection that didn't match his own. A quick gesture, a fixed gaze, as if something or someone was watching. The atmosphere in the house was heavy. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the ticking of a broken clock seemed to mark time irregularly. Daniel tried to ignore the unease, attributing it all to his tired mind. But deep down, he knew something was wrong, and the mirror, there in the corner, seemed to know it too. It was on a silent night, when the ticking of the clock seemed louder than ever, that Daniel realized the mirror was not just an object. He was sitting at his desk, as usual, staring at the blank screen of his computer, when something caught his attention. In the reflection of the mirror, he saw his own image rise from the chair. Daniel froze. He hadn't moved. The reflection, however, walked calmly around the room, as if exploring the space. It stopped in front of a bookshelf, touched the books, and then turned to Daniel with a smile that didn't match the look of terror on the man's face. "You're tired, Daniel," said the reflection, in a voice that was his but at the same time wasn't. "I understand." Daniel jumped up, knocking over the chair. He looked at the mirror, then at the spot where the reflection had been in the room. Nothing, just emptiness. But when he looked back at the mirror, the reflection was still there, standing in the middle of the room, watching him with piercing eyes. "How do you—" Daniel began, but the reflection interrupted. "I know everything about you. About Anna. About Sophia. About the guilt you carry. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. Those words were like daggers. He had never spoken to anyone about the accident, about what really happened that night. How could the reflection know? "You can't run from me," whispered the reflection as Daniel backed toward the door. He left the study, slamming the door shut. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself that this was just a nightmare, a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But when he looked down the hallway, he saw another mirror. And there was the reflection again, smiling. Daniel ran to the bedroom, covered the mirror with a sheet, and sat on the bed, trembling. He needed to get rid of it. But when he opened the nightstand drawer, he found a small hand mirror. And there was the reflection, again. "You can't run from me," repeated the voice, now coming from every corner of the house. Daniel threw the mirror on the floor, but it didn't break. Instead, the reflection laughed, a low, unsettling sound that echoed through the halls. "I am you, Daniel, and you can't hide from yourself." The tension in the air was palpable. Daniel felt like he was losing control, not just of the house, but of his own mind. The reflection knew things only he knew. And worse, it always seemed to be one step ahead. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat on the bed, staring at the UAB sheet covering the mirror, while the reflection's voice echoed in his mind. He knew this wasn't just a nightmare. It was real, and it was only just beginning. The following days were an endless nightmare for Daniel. The reflection no longer confined itself to the mirror in the study. It appeared in every corner of the house, on any surface that could reflect an image, in the window glass, on the screen, of the turned-off TV, even in the shine of a spoon left on the table. And then, something even more terrifying happened. One morning, as Daniel tried to have coffee in the kitchen, the reflection stepped out of the mirror. It wasn't gradual. One moment it was there, reflected on the wall. The next, it was standing in the middle of the kitchen, solid, real. Daniel nearly dropped his cup as he stumbled back, but the reflection just smiled as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "You don't need to be afraid of me," said the reflection, with a calm that contrasted with Daniel's terror. "I am you, only better." "What do you want?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. "I want what you no longer do. Your life." The reflection began to act. First, small things. It answered the phone when Daniel's editor called, speaking with a confidence Daniel hadn't felt in years. Then, it sat at the computer and started writing. Page after page of a book Daniel couldn't even begin. Daniel tried to intervene, but it was as if he didn't exist. The reflection ignored his attempts to stop the writing, as if he were an invisible spectator. When the neighbor knocked on the door to deliver a package, the reflection answered, chatted, laughed. Daniel stood by, trying to get the neighbor's attention, but the man didn't see him. It was as if the reflection had taken his place in the real world and he, Daniel, was becoming a ghost. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. Daniel tried to shout, to touch the reflection, but his hands passed right through it, as if it were made of mist. The reflection, however, could touch him. In a moment of rage, Daniel tried to push it, but the reflection grabbed his arm with a strength that wasn't human. "You can't beat me," said the reflection, with a smile that didn't reach its eyes. "I am what you could have been, if you weren't so weak." Daniel stepped back, his heart racing. He needed to do something, but what? The reflection was everywhere, controlling everything. Even the computer, where the book was being written, seemed to belong to it now. One night, as Daniel wandered the house, trying to find a solution, the reflection confronted him in the hallway. "I am you now," said the reflection, blocking his path. "And you're no longer necessary." Daniel tried to run, but the reflection grabbed him by the shoulder, spinning him around with brutal force. "Look at me," ordered the reflection, and Daniel had no choice. It was like looking at a distorted version of himself. The reflection had his features, but there was something in its eyes that wasn't human. Something cold, calculating, as if all the empathy and pain Daniel felt had been erased. "You can't beat me," the reflection repeated, releasing him. "But you can join me." Daniel stepped back, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't go on like this. He needed to find a way to get rid of the reflection before it was too late. But deep down, a small voice whispered, maybe it already was. It was in the attic that Daniel found the answers he was looking for. As he rummaged through forgotten boxes, hoping to find something that could help him, he stumbled upon an old, dusty journal. The cover was worn, and the pages yellowed with age. When he opened it, Daniel discovered that the house had a dark past. The previous owner, a man named Elias, had used the mirror in summoning rituals. The journal detailed experiments with lost souls, attempts to bring entities from a parallel world into ours. The mirror, according to the notes, was a portal, a gateway between dimensions. Daniel read the pages with wide eyes. The ritual required a sacrifice, the soul of whoever looked into the mirror with fear and doubt. Elias had failed, but the mirror remained, waiting for the next victim. "So that's it," Daniel murmured, feeling a chill run down his spine. "It's not my reflection. It's an entity." The final pages of the journal carried a warning. "The mirror can only be destroyed with strength and conviction. Whoever hesitates will be consumed." Daniel looked at the hammer beside him, used to open the boxes. He knew what he had to do. He descended the attic stairs with his heart racing, the hammer in one hand and the journal in the other. The reflection was in the study, sitting at the desk, writing another page of the book. It looked at Daniel with a calm smile, as if it already knew what he was planning. "You won't succeed," said the reflection without looking up from the paper. "I will," Daniel replied with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He approached the mirror, raising the hammer. The reflection finally stood up, but Daniel didn't hesitate. "This isn't the end," whispered the reflection, as Daniel prepared to strike. But Daniel wasn't listening anymore. He knew this was his only chance, and with a cry of rage and despair, he swung the hammer. The hammer hit the mirror with a loud crash, but the glass didn't shatter. Instead, a crack formed, spreading like a spiderweb. And then, something unexpected happened. From the cracked reflection, a hand emerged, grabbing Daniel's wrist with an inhuman strength. It was the reflection's hand, but now solid, real, and cold as the touch of death. "I warned you," whispered the reflection, pulling Daniel into the mirror. Daniel fought with all his might, trying to break free, but the hand was relentless. He felt the floor disappear beneath his feet as he was dragged into the mirror, as if being sucked into a vortex. The world around him distorted, colors and shapes blending into a whirlwind of chaos. Outside, the reflection took Daniel's place. It looked at the mirror, where the real man was now trapped, pounding on the glass and screaming in silence. The reflection smiled, adjusting its shirt as if nothing had happened. "Thank you, Daniel," said the reflection, in a voice that was almost a caricature of his own. "I'll take care of everything now." Inside the mirror, Daniel was in a world of darkness and silence. He could see the reflection outside living his life, but he could do nothing to stop it. The walls around him were like frosted glass, reflecting distorted images of himself. He screamed, pounded on the glass, but no sound came out. The reflection, now in control, sat at the desk and continued writing the book. It seemed so natural, so real, that even the house cat, which had always avoided Daniel, came to rub against its legs. Daniel watched helpless as the reflection took over his life. He tried to remember the words from the journal. "Whoever hesitates will be consumed." Had he hesitated, or was the reflection simply stronger? As the world around him closed in, Daniel realized there might be no escape. He was trapped, not just in the mirror, but in an endless nightmare. The reflection lived the life Daniel had never been able to. It finished the book, which became an instant success. It received praise, interviews, and even a literary award. Neighbors greeted it on the street, and the cat slept on its lap every night. Everything seemed perfect. Meanwhile, Daniel remained trapped in the mirror, watching it all from within his glass prison. He pounded on the glass, screamed, begged, but no one heard him. The reflection occasionally would look at him with a wicked smile, as if it knew exactly what Daniel was feeling. One night, as the reflection celebrated the book's release with a party at the house, Daniel gave up pounding on the glass. He sat on the floor of the dark, silent world, resigned. The reflection looked at him one last time, with a smile that didn't reach its eyes. "Good night, Daniel," said the reflection, before covering the mirror with a black sheet. And in the total darkness, Daniel realized this was his life now. A spectre, trapped in a world that was no longer his. Outside, the reflection raised a toast, surrounded by laughter and applause, and the house finally seemed happy. I was sitting on the couch, trying to relax after a day that seemed never-ending. The house was quiet, as always. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind hitting the window. Sounds I didn't even notice anymore. Until, suddenly, everything stopped. The silence was so abrupt that I felt my heart race. And then I heard it. A whisper. Low, constant, coming from all sides at once. I looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but there was nothing. Nothing but the silence and that voice that wouldn't stop whispering. I was alone. I had always been ever since I moved here. The house was my refuge, my safe place. At first, the silence was comforting, but now it felt wrong. As if something was missing, or worse, as if something was hidden within it. The whisper continued, insistent, as if it was trying to tell me something. I stood up, trying to locate where it was coming from. I walked through the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Nothing. Just the echo of that low voice, almost imperceptible, but always there. I stopped in front of the wall clock. It had stopped, the hands frozen in time. The living room window was open, but there was no wind, no sound coming from outside. Just the whisper, which now seemed a little louder, as if it was getting closer. I felt watched. Someone, or something, was there with me. The whisper began to change. It was no longer just a low, indistinct sound. Now, it seemed like someone was trying to speak to me. Words I couldn't understand, but that sounded urgent, almost desperate. I tried to focus, to decipher what that voice was trying to say, but it was useless. The more I tried, the more distant it seemed. That's when I saw them. Shadows, moving in the corners of the room, always at the edge of my vision. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, just emptiness. But I knew they were there. I could feel them. With each passing moment, they got closer, always in silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to suffocate the air around me. I tried to turn on the lights, but they flickered once, twice, and then went out. Darkness took over the house, and the whisper turned into something else. A low murmur, almost like a muffled laugh. I curled up in the corner of the room, trying to make myself small, invisible. The shadows were closer now, almost within reach. And the whisper, it was no longer a voice. It was something deeper, more primal. Something that didn't belong to this world. I couldn't stay still. I needed to find out what was happening. With my heart pounding, I decided to investigate. The house felt different now, as if every corner hid a secret I wasn't ready to discover. In the back room, I found something that changed everything. An old, dusty journal, forgotten in a drawer. The pages were yellowed, and the handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. The journal spoke about the house, about a portal, a place called the World of Silence, where lost souls were trapped, condemned to wander in eternal silence. The author wrote about moving shadows, about whispers that couldn't be ignored. And then, a sentence that made me freeze. They want company. I tried to ignore it, to close the journal, but the whisper returned, louder this time. Now it was muffled screams, as if dozens of voices were trying to speak at once. The shadows were no longer just indistinct shapes. They had faces now, distorted, desperate faces with empty eyes that seemed to stare directly at me. I ran from one room to another trying to escape, but the shadows were everywhere. They followed me, always in silence, always getting closer. Until I reached the basement. The door was locked, but the whisper was coming from there, stronger than ever. My hands trembled as I tried to open it. I knew I shouldn't, but something pulled me inside, something I couldn't ignore. The door gave way with a low creak, and then everything changed. I tried to run. I rushed back to the stairs, but the doors and windows were locked. The house wouldn't let me leave. Suddenly, an invisible force pulled me to the ground. It was as if the air around me had come alive, dragging me toward the basement. I struggled, tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth, and then I was sucked in. The world around me crumbled, and I fell into a place that made no sense. It was dark, but not like night. It was a darkness that felt alive, pulsating. The shadows were there, but now they were more than that. They were souls, distorted faces, outstretched hands, trying to touch me. I tried to scream, but the silence was absolute. They got closer, closer, and I knew what they wanted. Company. Someone to share that eternity of silence. I felt their despair, the pain of centuries without a voice. And then I realized I was losing mine too. My voice was disappearing, as if the silence was consuming me from within. I couldn't let them trap me there. I fought with all my strength, trying to pull away from those desperate souls. But the more I fought, the more I felt the silence swallowing me. My voice was gone, and my body felt heavier, as if it was merging with the darkness around me. The souls surrounded me completely, their icy hands almost touching me. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on something, anything that could save me. That's when I felt a spark inside me, a last desperate attempt. I opened my mouth and tried to scream, but there was no sound, just an impulse, an energy that surged from my despair. Suddenly, a bright light exploded around me. The souls recoiled, their distorted faces twisted in pain and fear. The light enveloped me, warm and comforting, and I felt my body being pulled away from that place. The darkness began to dissipate, and for a moment I thought I was free, but then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the house, on the couch as if nothing had happened. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it had all been a nightmare. But then I tried to speak. Nothing. No sound came out of my mouth. And that's when I realized I had never left that place. The silence was still with me. I looked around, hoping something would change, that the nightmare would end. But the house was exactly as I had left it. Silent. Too silent. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was gone. It was as if the silence had stolen something essential from me. That's when I saw them again, the shadows, in the corners of the room, in the hallways, hovering at the edge of my vision. They were there, watching, waiting. I hadn't escaped. The world of silence still belonged to me, an absolute stillness. The last thing you hear is the whisper, that same whisper that started it all. It echoes for a moment, before fading away, leaving only silence. It was midnight when the knocks began. 3 sharp raps on the door, as if someone outside was growing impatient. He rose from his armchair, heart racing, and walked to the entrance. The house was silent, except for the echo of the knocks that still seemed to reverberate through the walls. When he opened the door, there was no one there. The darkness outside was absolute, and the cold wind cut through the air like a warning. He closed the door, trying to convince himself that he had imagined it all. But as soon as he turned around, the knocks returned. This time, louder, more insistent. He lived alone in that remote house, in the middle of a rural area where the night seemed to swallow everything around him. Loneliness was his only companion, and silence his greatest enemy. The camera shows the house, isolated and vulnerable, surrounded by trees that whispered in the wind. He looked out the living room window, but there was only darkness outside. The flashlight in his hand trembled, and the sound of the knocks echoed in his mind. Something was wrong, something he couldn't explain. The following nights were a nightmare. The knocks on the door repeated, always at midnight, like a cursed clock. He tried to ignore them, covering his head with a pillow, but the sound was relentless. Until one night, he saw something. As he peered out the kitchen window, a shadowy figure appeared outside, standing under the faint light of the moon. It was just a silhouette, indistinct, but he felt its gaze fixed on him. When he blinked, the figure was gone. He decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped outside, determined to find an explanation. The flickering light cut through, the darkness revealing only tall grass and skeletal trees. Nothing, no trace of anyone. But as he returned inside, he felt something. A presence. The house felt different, as if the air had grown heavier. He locked the door, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It was on the 3rd night that the figure entered. He was in the living room trying to distract himself with the TV when he heard a noise from the hallway. Slowly he turned and saw the silhouette standing at the end of the corridor, motionless. His heart raced. He tried to scream, but his voice failed him. The figure began to move, gliding toward him, and he backed away until he hit the wall. When he turned on the light, there was no one there. From then on, the figure began to appear inside the house, always at midnight. He tried calling the police, but his phone had no signal. The radio only emitted static, and the internet was dead. The house seemed cut off from the outside world. He locked all the doors and windows, but the figure was still there, getting closer each time. Footsteps echoed through the halls and whispers reached his ears as if someone was calling his name. He no longer knew what to do. The house, once his refuge, had become a prison. He knew he needed answers. The shadowy figure wasn't just an illusion, it was real, and it was trying to tell him something. With his heart pounding, he climbed the stairs to the attic, a place he had always avoided. Dust covered everything and the air was heavy, as if time had stopped there. That's when he found it. An old, yellowed newspaper with a headline that sent chills down his spine. Brutal. Murder in rural house, resident found dead 50 years ago. The photos showed the house, exactly as it was now, and the face of a man, the former resident. He flipped through the newspaper with trembling hands, finding personal items of the victim. A wallet, a broken watch, a faded photograph. The shadowy figure was the spirit of that man, trapped in the house where his life had been taken. He realized the spirit didn't want to hurt him. It wanted help. But how could he help someone who was already dead? The shadowy figure didn't wait. That night, it came with an intensity he had never felt before. He was in the hallway, trying to think of a way to help the spirit, when the lights flickered and went out. The flashlight in his hand shook, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Then, He saw it. The figure was at the end of the hallway, but this time it didn't stop. It began to move toward him, fast and silent, like a living shadow. He ran. The doors he tried to open were all locked, and the windows seemed sealed by an invisible force. The house, once familiar, had turned into a maze of dark hallways and creaking doors. The figure was always there, appearing and disappearing as if toying with him. He entered the kitchen, but it was already there, standing by the table. He stumbled backward, tripping, and fell to the floor. When he looked up, the figure was above him, its face finally visible, a dark void, with only a sinister smile. He scrambled back until he hit a wall. The figure approached, reaching out a hand that seemed made of shadow. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The flashlight fell to the ground, rolling to the figure's feet. The flickering light briefly illuminated its face, and he saw something in its eyes: pain, anger, despair. Then the figure lunged. He tried to defend himself, but his hands passed right through it, as if it were made of smoke. The last thing he saw was the figure diving toward him before everything went dark. He woke up with a start, gasping, and it took him a few seconds to realize where he was. The white ceiling of the hospital, the smell of antiseptic, the sound of machines beeping beside him. A doctor approached, explaining that he had been found unconscious at home with no signs of violence. "You're lucky," they said. He tried to speak, to tell them about the figure, about the spirit, but the words wouldn't come. When he was alone, he looked out the hospital room window. Outside, the day was bright, but something caught his attention. Reflected in the glass, against the sunlight, was the shadowy figure. It watched him, motionless, with that same sinister smile. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure raised a hand, as if saying goodbye, and then disappeared. He knew this wasn't the end. The figure was still there, waiting, and sooner or later, it would return.